Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday I released a video uh, showing how Pope Francis had said some pretty unfortunate things about mainly young priests who are attached to the Latin Mass and young people in general. And it's caused quite the firestorm, not just my video, but the comments themselves in his memoir. And I started thinking, we hear all this stuff about traditional Catholics, whether it's from the staunchest of Novus Ordo defenders or from liberals in the church. And it's a lot of negative things. You know, traditional Catholics are rude. Traditional Catholics are schismatics. Traditional Catholics are prideful. We get called Protestants all the time. I don't know where that one comes from. I've yet to find a Protestant who fills his house with iconography of the Virgin Mary and prays the rosary. But anyway, we get a lot of insults. But what is a traditional Catholic? What are we actually? We're going to discuss that. Stay tuned. So what is a traditional Catholic, my friends? Well, a traditional Catholic is a Catholic. A traditional Catholic is someone who looks at the history of the church and says, that was probably a good thing, and looks at the novelties that have emanated since the Second Vatican Council and from it in many ways, and says to himself, I'm not really a fan of that. A traditional Catholic tries his best to resist the worldliness that is thrust down our throats from the culture and in the very worldly atmosphere of most Novus Ordo parishes. A traditional Catholic is someone who not only wants to follow the teachings of the Catholic Church, but wants to follow all the teachings of the Catholic Church, because there are many teachings of the Church that are binding, that are taught authoritatively, that are basically forgotten. One of the big ones is a condemnation of religious liberty, which is often forgotten. That's just an example. A traditional Catholic is into modesty. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a dress code, but there's a reason why you see a lot of traditional Catholic ladies wearing skirts. Pants are not intrinsically evil, but women didn't really wear pants until the feminist revolution, which is a historical fact. You can check that for yourself. And they wore them in order to dress like men. That was the intention behind it. In fact, you can find these funny pictures of women 100 years ago, 120 years ago, protesting for the right to vote, which was really a subterfuge kind of Trojan horse movement to bring in feminism in general. And they're wearing dresses with pants underneath to show that they can be like men. There's funny pictures of that. Traditional Catholics attend the traditional Latin Mass. And of course, there are Eastern Catholics who are traditionally minded, and I guess would be a traditionalist in that sense, but it's kind of something that applies to the Roman Church or the Latin side of the Roman Catholic Church, I should say, just because that's where we've had the most radical changes in liturgy. Although there have been some pretty significant changes in a lot of the Eastern Rite liturgies, especially in the Chaldean Rite, for example. In any event, a traditional Catholic attends the Old Mass. And why does he attend the Old Mass? Is it because he loves smells and bells? Well, he might, and there's nothing wrong with that. Smells and bells are good. I mean, we're human beings. We have senses. We have an intellect. We have a psychology. We have a personality. There have always been smells and bells in the worship of Almighty God. In the Old Testament, read the prescriptions about what was to take place in the temples. I mean, talk about smells and bells. You know, gold coverings on altars and, legions of choir singers, massive ceremonies, tons of pomp and circumstance. I mean, the prescriptions for some of the vestments and for the construction of the temple for very ornate reasons, you can find those literally in the scriptures. There's nothing wrong with smells and bells, but it is more than that. We understand as traditional Catholics that the holy sacrifice of the Mass is the same sacrifice of Calvary. It's represented. Christ is not sacrificed again. We understand that the Mass is propitiatory, meaning it's for the forgiveness of sins, because we still sin. We understand that it's a sacrifice and not a communal meal. And it's also for adoration and thanksgiving. And traditional Catholics all over the world, they attend Mass in chapels that are very bare bones because there's not a lot of money for them. They build chapels in their homes for retired priests to come say the old Mass for them. They go out of their way to find ways to educate their children that require a lot of sacrifice, because even a lot of Catholic schools that are conservative, they're really giving the kids a modernist theological education, even if they're giving them a good education otherwise, so you can't send your kids there if you can help it. They go hunting for a lot of old books, and they basically just live in a countercultural way. And there's nothing wrong with that. Traditional Catholics are, by and large, very good people. Sure, we're all sinners, and we're all evil in a sense that we all sin. But God created us all good, and we do our best to follow the perennial teachings of the Church. We get beaten down. We take a lot of flack from our families. A lot of the time we lose friends who think that we're unkind and uncharitable, which is why they stop being friends with us, ironically. We have to put up with second-class treatment, accusations of schism, Pharisaism, I guess is the right word. We get the bad end of the stick all the time. We don't do this because we think we're better than anyone. I'm sure there are trads who think that, because there are sinners everywhere, and you're a sinner and I'm a sinner. But in general, you don't drive your family an hour and a half in bad weather to go to Mass at 3 p.m. at a mission chapel because you think you're better than somebody. You do that actually because you think you're worse than everyone. It's really hard being a traditional Catholic. It's really hard. In fact, it's naturally speaking kind of impossible. But we do it anyway. We drive those long distances to go to our chapels because we know that we're in the greatest fight that you can ever imagine. The infiltration and destruction attempted by the enemies of the Church is an evil so great that we know we have to do whatever we can to participate in the true Renaissance in the Church. We know that the conciliar reforms have been a disaster. We know that the Second Vatican Council, although there are many things that are fine, there are plenty of documents or parts of documents where you could say there's an error, or at least you're scratching your head going, this sure sounds like an error, even if they can wiggle out of that somehow. We know that we can't even really tell our kids what the popes have been saying. There are plenty of okay things, but we almost have to shield our kids from the things that the Pope says, and not just Pope Francis. We know that we're not welcome in the sandbox with everybody else, yet we persist. We would not do that if it was for personal gain. I mean, it's one thing, for example, if you make some sort of esoteric cult and you get really rich and you don't mind that you're in this thing that people don't like because you have tons of personal benefits. But that, my friends, does not happen in traditional Catholicism. The gas bills alone and driving our big families to Mass, all those long distances, makes sure that traditional Catholicism isn't going to make you rich. We make huge sacrifices economically. We try to live by the natural law. We do our best to have it so that our wives can stay home. It's not always possible, but we do our best to try to make that the case, which means we make a lot of economic sacrifices. You know, I think traditional Catholics are probably North America's greatest thrift store customers. I think I can probably count on 2 or 3 fingers all the guys I know in my circles that actually buy their suits new rather than find them at the thrift store and get them tailored. Traditional Catholics are the salt of the earth. They don't deserve these accusations. And not just from Pope Francis, but from the who's who in the Catholic media, who label them as X, Y, and Z. They don't deserve that, and it's really sinful. But we know as traditional Catholics that our Lord warned us of false prophets. When we say things like there's been, an infection within the church's hierarchy of modernists and so forth, we don't for a second believe that this means the Catholic Church has failed. In fact, we believe what the Catholic Church teaches so much that we actually think the scriptures are true. So we read things like when Christ says, beware of false prophets. We say, yeah, Christ was right. I trust Jesus Christ. We look at the things that lots of clerics have said in the last however many decades, and we say, yeah, Christ was right. We understand that you have to be a discerning person in the true sense of the word. You can't trust everything that comes out of Rome, unfortunately. But we also understand that God has a plan. And we don't know when the difficulties will end. And we don't know what will come with it. Or come of it. We don't even know if we'll be alive for a true restoration of the church. It could happen like the end of a war of attrition. Maybe it's the case that the sort of conciliar experiment just fails to the point where there's nobody left to defend it anymore and there's basically just trads. I don't know. It could happen by divine intervention. Who knows? Both of those things seem to be kind of possible in the Old Testament. You see sometimes God really stepping in obvious ways. But it's often after many hundreds of years of exile, or at least many decades. We also understand as traditional Catholics that we will be treated poorly as long as modernism reigns in the church. And that's something that we come to accept. It's harder for some. Every traditional Catholic goes through it's kind of like the 12-step process. You have the denial and the bargaining and all that. And then eventually you just have the acceptance. You go, yeah, I'm the red-headed stepchild, proverbial red-headed stepchild. I'm the black sheep. And then the funny thing is once you do that, you start making the greatest friends. And this is something that I wish a lot of the people who accuse trads of joylessness and legalism and rigorism and all this kind of stuff, I wish they could just come spend some time. I can only talk about my experience, but I've been to a lot of places in North America and in Europe at traditional Catholic events and interact with people from all over the world. And everywhere I go, when I find out somebody is a traditional Catholic, it's like we're best friends. It's an amazing thing. And we have a lot of fun. I'll give you some insight into how me and my friends spend our time. We get together, we make a campfire, we drink beer, and we smoke cigars and pipes. And we talk about politics, we talk about sports, we talk about our kids, and we laugh a ton. We don't even really talk about the church that much. Sure, when you're fresh to tradition, and you can always spot somebody who's really on fire because they just discovered the third secret of Fatima, or they just discovered, Taylor Marshall's podcast, or all these good things, but they've really just discovered them. And it's like drinking from a fire hose, and they just want to talk about it. And it's kind of, it's not funny in a funny haha, look at you sense, but it's funny. It's like, yeah, we've all been there. And you go through 2 or 3 years where you're just absorbing and consuming so much information because you're really kind of relearning things or learning for the first time. You're experiencing a re-education of things you should have known your whole life. And it's really exhilarating. But then eventually you kind of calm down. And when you get to that point, you honestly just find so much great stability. And you find this real peace. 99% of the traditional masses I've been to have been the SSPX. But I've almost never heard our priests preach about the crisis in the church from the pulpit. I really haven't. Yes, when we have catechism meetings or third order meetings, or our priests recommend reading and various readings and things like that, they'll recommend definitely understand what the crisis in the church is. But from the pulpit, it's just glorious, beautiful Catholicism. It's the saints and the great popes and good old scriptural exegesis. There's an interior quiet, in my opinion, that you get in traditional Catholicism. And I never found this when I was in the Nova Sordo. I'm sure there are some that do, but I know my story is not rare. When you find that old-time religion, it's like you're going home to a place that you didn't even know you were homesick for. Now, some people, when they first encounter tradition, they have this almost ecstatic experience. Some people, I've heard stories, I'm sure you have. They go to their first traditional mass and they feel like they're in heaven. Others, it's a low mass, like this is my first experience. I didn't know it started. That's a super common experience. But after a certain amount of time, you get recalibrated. And then it's true that the Novus Ordo and the new stuff really does become painful. That's a fact. And now, if you don't stop going to the Novus Ordo, you don't start to get to that place of pain, usually. But if you go 5 or 6 months, never stepping foot in a Novus Ordo liturgy of any sort, when you have to go back for some sort of, baptism or somebody's wedding or something like that, you really start to feel that ache of what's happening. Now, of course, people are imperfect and maybe some get resentful and angry. But my experience and my experience talking to so many is that it's sad. It's not that they hate the people that made this happen. Well, they shouldn't. But it's like Christ weeping over Jerusalem. It's a tragedy, what's happened in the church. So a lot of people who don't like trads and, people who echo Pope Francis's statements, they accuse us of being rigid or whatever. And I guess we are. The saints were pretty rigid, weren't they? Meaning they weren't very flexible on matters of Catholicism. That's what rigid means. I'm proudly rigid. I don't want to bend or break when it comes to doctrine. And I don't want to bend or break when it comes to perennial Catholic traditions and customs. I don't think we should. But there's also something that needs to be addressed here is Catholics who attend the traditional Mass and make it their home, that they feel pain and sadness when they go to the new stuff, and that experience is universal. That's not a defect of the person's psychology, because they're just doing what their ancestors did. If it's wrong to do the stuff that your ancestors did, that's a problem. The defect is not with the traditionalist who can't get hip with the new springtime. The defect is with the new springtime. And ultimately, this is why you see all these insults about traditional Catholics. There really are no strong arguments against strong traditional Catholic scholarship. You're not going to find anybody destroying Dr. Kwasniewski's Once and Future Roman Rite. It's like impossible. That book is magnificent. You're not going to find anybody hammering Michael Davies, and he's so wrong about the history of the liturgy and the Second Vatican Council. You might get different opinions, but you're not going to find people destroying that type of scholarship. And what's amazing about that scholarship is that it's accessible. You know, the biggest minds in traditional Catholicism, the Kwasniewskis, the Desmates, the Michael Davies, God rest his soul, men like that, anyone can read their books. That's what's amazing about it. But if you go try to pick up some explanation of personalism or the new theology, I was talking to somebody whose kids went to Steubenville, and we were talking about the philosophy and theology that's really hip and happening in the new springtime. And we're saying how it's like so hard to understand, even if you're a big reader. And he told his kids, nobody understands it, so just tell your professors what they want to hear. That was all they could really do. But traditional Catholicism, anybody can understand it. That's what's so amazing about it. I mean, Thomas Aquinas can be complicated if you pick up the Summa and you've never read it. But you can break down Thomas Aquinas in really simple terms because it's really just common sense theology. Whereas the new stuff, it's like written by PhDs who expect you to be a PhD to really get it, which is one of the reasons why there's so much confusion, because you can interpret it 1,000 different ways. You can't do that with Aquinas. This brings me to another point is, trads, we understand that Catholicism isn't supposed to be something the world likes, and it's also not supposed to be something for the elites. It's not a religion of scholars. It's a religion of saints. Saints can be scholars. Saints can be illiterate children. But the faith really is simple. And in the new springtime, it's just made so complicated. Constantly having new catechism updates, constantly changing and updating the missal, constantly trying to explain the new Mass again and again and again and again, writing huge tomes of work to defend very minute points of doctrine in the Second Vatican Council. And as a trad, you just look at that and you go, there's no way this is what it's supposed to be. Because Catholicism isn't an academic pursuit. It's how you save your soul. And that has to be accessible to everybody. It can't just be something for scholars. Anyway, traditional Catholicism is beautiful. Traditional Catholicism is true. Traditional Catholicism is Catholicism. And I imagine the insults will continue. I imagine we'll be maligned and calumniated because we're so uncharitable by the greatest defenders of the new springtime. But that's okay, isn't it? Because Christ said, if they hate you, it's because they hated me first. If I were part of the Nova Sordo stream, and I was in a situation where we were looking for worldly acclaim, I would be nervous. I don't want worldly acclaim. I hope the world hates me, because that's how you conform to Christ. So, if the new springtime hates trads, it's probably a good sign. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you today. And before I go, I wanted to tell you about something that can help your traditional Catholic faith. And that is the Canadian Martyrs Men's Conference. Check the link in the description area. We're going to defend the rights of Christ the King this year at this conference, the 100th anniversary of Quas Primas. Best traditional Catholic men's conference you're ever going to go to. I hope to see you there. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Mere Tradition. Until next time, God bless.